Every music lover has at least one album that somehow becomes more than just a collection of songs. You don't choose it. It simply arrives at exactly the right moment in your life, and without even realizing it, becomes part of your story. More than 40 years later, I can still point to mine. It isn't Japan's most famous album, and many fans would probably choose Tin Drum, Gentlemen Take Polaroids, or Quiet Life instead. I completely understand why, because those albums represent the artistic peak of one of the most remarkable bands of the early 1980s. But for me, it has always been Oil on Canvas. Not only is it my favourite Japan album, it is probably my favourite live album of all time. The interesting thing is that I had absolutely no idea when I first put the needle on the record that I was listening to the album which would stay with me for the rest of my life. I was around 19 or 20 years old, living with my mum in Hørsholm, just north of Copenhagen, and had recently started my first year at high school after spending a year working at a cinema in Copenhagen. It was one of those exciting periods in life where everything seemed possible. I had earned my first serious money, bought my first synthesizer, a Korg Poly 61, and music was beginning to evolve from something I simply loved into something I wanted to create myself. At school, I became close friends with 3 guys who were just as obsessed with new wave synthpop and new romantic music as I was. Together, we discovered albums through a British mail-order catalogue, ordering records from the UK with little more than a band name, a photograph on the cover, or the occasional song to guide us. Buying records back then was almost an act of faith. There was no YouTube, no streaming, and no easy way of hearing an album before buying it. Every new arrival was a mystery waiting to be explored, and perhaps that's one of the reasons those records became such personal experiences. I already knew Japan from Tin Drum, although I honestly can't remember whether I owned the album myself at that point. What I do remember is seeing Oil on Canvas in that catalogue. Something about it caught my attention, and like so many albums we ordered during those years, it arrived with very few expectations beyond curiosity. When I finally placed the record on the turntable, I knew almost nothing about how it had been made. I didn't know it wasn't a conventional live album. I didn't know it had been recorded during Japan's final tour, and I certainly didn't know the band had already decided to go their separate ways. None of that mattered. What I heard was something much simpler and much more powerful. I heard a world opening up before me. Looking back, I realize I entered Japan's world through the soundscapes. At the time, I had become completely fascinated by synthesizers, spending countless hours learning melodies, bass lines and programming sounds by ear, working out parts from artists like Depeche Mode, The Human League and others from the emerging synth pop scene. Naturally, when I listened to Oil on Canvas for the first time, my ears were drawn straight to Richard Barbieri. I had never heard synthesizers used like that before. Instead of simply using them to play parts, he used them to create atmosphere. He painted beautiful, mysterious and almost otherworldly landscapes that surrounded the rest of the band. Even today, that's still the image that comes to mind whenever I think about Oil on Canvas. His synthesizers didn't simply accompany the songs, they created places you could almost step into. Years later, I discovered that this was exactly what Richard Barbieri had been trying to achieve. He has often explained that he was never interested in becoming a traditional keyboard virtuoso. Instead, he wanted to create atmosphere, texture, and space. Looking back now, I realize that without knowing it, I was hearing precisely what he had intended. As a young listener, I couldn't have explained why his playing affected me so deeply, but I felt it immediately. Then, with every new listen, another layer of Japan slowly revealed itself. Next came Mick Karn. His fretless bass didn't behave like any bass I had heard before. It sang. It answered the melodies, drifted around the keyboards, and almost became another lead instrument. Before long, I found myself listening for his bass lines just as much as the vocals. Only later did I begin to appreciate Steve Jansen's extraordinary precision behind the drums. Together, he and Mick Karn created one of the tightest and most distinctive rhythm sections of the early 1980s, playing with remarkable restraint while giving the music an effortless sense of movement. And then, almost surprisingly, David Sylvian's voice and lyrics gradually came into focus. I know that may sound strange because, for many people, David is the obvious focal point of Japan. But that wasn't my experience. First came the atmosphere, then the instruments, then the voice, and finally the words. Even the band's visual style came later. I honestly don't think I even noticed there were guitars in the music during those first listens. I had become so absorbed by the atmosphere that everything else blended into this extraordinary sound world. That, perhaps more than anything else, explains why Oil on Canvas affected me so deeply. I wasn't simply listening to an album. I was discovering an entirely new musical universe, one layer at a time. When I first bought Oil on Canvas, I simply assumed it was a live album. Only years later did I discover that it was something much more unusual. Most of the performances had been recorded during Japan's final concerts at London's Hammersmith Odeon in November 1982, but the band had no intention of producing a straightforward document of those shows. Instead, they created something that existed somewhere between a live album and a studio album. Several studio recordings were carefully woven into the running order, and parts of the live performances were refined afterwards. On paper, that might sound like a compromise. To me, it became one of the album's greatest strengths. The more I learned about Oil on Canvas, the more I realized that Japan hadn't been trying to capture a concert exactly as it happened. They were trying to create the best possible listening experience. Rather than simply presenting one song after another with applause in between, they shaped the album almost like a film. The studio pieces don't interrupt the journey. They deepen it, allowing the music to breathe before gently leading you into the next performance and making the album feel less like a collection of songs and more like one continuous artistic experience. Perhaps that's why I never really thought of Oil on Canvas as a typical live album. Even though I was always aware of the audience, they were never the main attraction. Their applause reminded me that I was listening to a real performance, but it never distracted me from the music itself. Sometimes I imagined myself standing somewhere in that crowd at Hammersmith, completely absorbed by what was happening on stage. More often, though, the music carried me somewhere else entirely. Over the years, there has been plenty of discussion among fans about how much of the album was reworked in the studio after the concerts. Some audience ambience may even have been enhanced. To me, though, that has never mattered. The album has never felt dishonest. It has always felt intentional. Japan weren't trying to produce an audio snapshot of one evening on stage. They were creating a complete artistic statement using every tool available to them. Ironically, when I first fell in love with the album, I knew almost none of this. I didn't know these concerts marked the end of Japan. I didn't know the band had already decided to go their separate ways, or that Oil on Canvas would eventually become their highest charting album in the UK after they had split. Those facts only became part of the story years later. They added another layer to an album I already loved, but they were never the reason I loved it. For me, Oil on Canvas had already become something much simpler and perhaps much more important. It wasn't just a recording of Japan performing live. It was an experience that somehow felt complete from beginning to end, one that I could return to again and again, always discovering another detail I hadn't noticed before. Looking back now, I think that's why I once described it as the biography of Japan. Not because it tells the band's entire story, but because it captures everything that made them unique. Their atmosphere, their musicianship, their elegance, and the remarkable artistic identity they had reached by the end of 1982 all seemed to come together in this one extraordinary album. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder whether growing up before the internet made albums like Oil on Canvas even more powerful. Today, we can discover almost everything about an artist within minutes. We can watch live performances, read interviews, and learn the story behind every album with just a few clicks. Back then it was different. Records demanded imagination, and perhaps that's why they became such deeply personal experiences. For me, Oil on Canvas became far more than something I listened to. I would sit alone in my bedroom wearing headphones, and before long, I wasn't really in Hirschholm anymore. Sometimes I imagine myself standing among the audience at Hammersmith Odeon, watching Japan perform these extraordinary songs. More often though, the music carried me somewhere much further away. Richard Barbieri's atmospheric synthesizers, Mick Karn's expressive fretless bass, Steve Jansen's beautifully understated drumming, Masami Tsuchiya's elegant guitar work, and David Sylvian's increasingly evocative lyrics seemed to open the door to another world. In my imagination, I travelled to distant, exotic places. Of course, Japan itself became part of that picture, inspired by the band's name and aesthetic. But it was never really about geography. It was about a feeling. The music seemed to exist somewhere between reality and imagination, and every time I listened, it painted new pictures in my mind. The remarkable thing is that I can no longer remember exactly what those pictures look like. They've faded over the years. But I remember the feeling perfectly. The excitement, the mystery, and the sense that this music came from somewhere completely different to anything I had heard before. It transported me to places I couldn't describe then, and probably still can't describe today. Perhaps that's why the album became so important to me. It arrived at exactly the right moment. I had just bought my first synthesizer. I was learning to play by ear and had started making music with friends from school. For the first time, I could imagine that music might become more than just a hobby. Oil on Canvas didn't teach me how to write songs or program synthesizers, but it quietly expanded my understanding of what music could be. It showed me that sound could create atmosphere, emotion, and places every bit as vividly as words or pictures. Over the following decades, music became my profession. I spent years composing, recording, and performing, and like so many musicians, I gradually found myself listening differently. Instead of simply enjoying an album, I would often find myself analysing it. I'd notice the production, the arrangements, the sounds, and the performances. It's almost unavoidable when you've spent so much of your life making music yourself. Sometimes I miss the way I used to listen, the innocent listener who simply allowed the music to take him wherever it wanted to go. But every now and then, I put on Oil on Canvas, and something rather special happens. For a while, I stop thinking like a producer. I stop analysing. Instead, I simply allow myself to listen. Not because I forget everything I've learned over the years, but because the album somehow reaches beyond all of that. It still has the ability to draw me into its world, just as it did when I was 19 years old. I've often wondered whether I would feel the same way if I were discovering Oil on Canvas for the first time today. Perhaps I would. Perhaps I wouldn't. The world has changed. The way we discover music has changed, and even the way we listen has changed. But maybe that's exactly why this album still means so much to me. It reminds me of a time when discovering music felt like an adventure. When an album could arrive in the post from a record shop hundreds of kilometers away, and all you really had to guide you was a photograph on the cover, a band name, and your own curiosity. Music didn't just fill your room, it filled your imagination. I don't actually listen to Oil on Canvas very often anymore. Perhaps that's because some albums become so special that you almost want to protect what they mean to you. I like knowing that when I do put it on, it's still an occasion. It's like opening a familiar door that has been quietly waiting for me all these years. Every time that door opens, I find myself back in that bedroom in Hirschholm. Headphones on. listening to a band that seemed unlike anyone else. Sometimes I'm standing among the audience at Hammersmith. Other times I'm traveling somewhere far beyond it, somewhere mysterious, distant, and impossible to define. Somewhere that only exists because of the music. I hear more today than I did back then. I notice details in the arrangements, the production, and the performances that my 19-year-old self could never have recognized. But every now and then, something rather wonderful happens. For a little while I stop listening as a musician, and I simply listen as that young man again. Perhaps that's why Oil on Canvas has never really left me. Not because I believe it's the greatest live album ever made, but because somehow it became part of who I am.